Hey everyone, and welcome to our session on Squeaky Clean Copy. My name is Kelly Juntunen, and this session is a way to review errors, tighten text, and generally create more readable stories. So a little bit of background on me. My very first professional job was as a newspaper copy editor. So you are listening to a bona fide word nerd. I hope that this lesson gives you some examples on how to incorporate editing into your production cycle, because it is an important part of creating a yearbook. So we're going to start off with, why is editing important? You can ask your students this as you're beginning this process of explaining copy editing to them. Why is editing important? Well, big picture, it's important for credibility. It's important for people to take you seriously. You could hear answers like, it's important because you don't want to get people's names wrong, and that's pretty much the biggest sin in yearbook world, is to get someone's name wrong. But ask your students why editing is important. Ask them if they've ever noticed an error in a publication, in a yearbook, in a newspaper, and what that made them think about that particular publication. The next question that you could ask your students is, why is self-editing difficult? And this is really where we're going to talk today about the opposite of self-editing, which is round-robin editing, editing as a group, because self-editing is hard. What you think that you are saying from brain to paper, sometimes there's a disconnect there. And so you might think that you have gotten the point across, but when someone else reads it, it's not quite what you intended. So self-editing is hard. And so we want to utilize the collaborative nature of yearbook so that we're not doing this alone. Everyone needs an editor, no matter what level of publication you get to. Professional journalists, they have editors as well. So we want to use the rest of our staff to make sure that what we are writing makes sense and it's consistent with the guidelines that we have in place for ourselves. Now, I'm going to footnote this with the expectation that your writers should submit copy as clean as possible on their own. And so you might have checklists, you might have standards that you tell them to follow before they turn in copy to be edited, because you don't want to get really messy copy to start with. So you want writers to do the very best job they can on their own, and then you have your copy editors and your content editors to take you to the next level. So what we're going to talk about is the difference between the writing process, content editing, and copy editing. So the writing process is where your writer is actively writing their story. And sometimes this is very messy because you have lots of different quotes, you have interviews that are all over the place. And you're just trying to kind of make sense of all of this stuff that you have. So you're putting things in a format to create a story. And so the writing process is pretty messy. When you get to content editing, that's usually the very first editor who's going to look at the first draft of a story. Sometimes you'll hear people say that this is like high level editing, because really it's big picture. Actually, I'm going to get into more details about this, about content editing and the difference in copy editing. So content editing is big picture editing, and then copy editing is that last step, fine-tuning what's been written. So I kind of group the writing process and the editing process into these three separate categories. So let's talk a little bit about content editing. So I said that this is higher level. This is big picture. When a story gets turned in and someone's editing for content, really what we're looking for is this the right format for this story, and is it done correctly? Maybe this story would lend itself more towards some kind of alternative copy. And you guys have some really great sessions about alternative copy if you want to look at options for that as well. So is this the right format for the story? And have they followed the format correctly? Feature stories have a very specific format. Quote collections, are styled very similarly. So you want to make sure that the format is correct. The next thing that you're looking for is, does the story have a logical flow? Does it make sense from start to finish? And then this is a big question with kids. Did we interview the appropriate people? It's easy to interview our friends. It's easy to interview nice people who are very happy to be interviewed. And so we keep interviewing these same people over and over again. So at content editing, we can say, hey, that person has already been interviewed for 4 stories. Let's go find someone else. Or why didn't we interview someone who actually was in the school play instead of someone who attended? So thinking about the appropriateness of the people that we interview, this is in content editing. Now, from content editing, you might have a lot of big changes. And so that's why we want to look big picture at this point. Here's an example of a story that has some sample content editing on it. A student wrote the story. Some of the things that I was looking for, and this is a fake story, was maybe the writer has really gone off the edge of too dramatic. And so we want to kind of pull that back a little bit. So we're just really recognizing big picture, this is a little bit too much. Maybe the flow could use some follow-up. So this particular story talks about a concussion. Maybe we need to include some additional information about concussion later on. We also want to recognize places where a story is too generic. Is it something that could apply to any story, any year? If that's the case, let's cut that out. So we're eliminating generic spots as well. And then also with content editing, you could recognize things in a story that would really be great as a sidebar, as a special little pull-out box, or something else that would be an alternative copy option. So copy editing is different than content editing. Copy editing is where we get into the details. An editor who is editing for copy is looking for every error. This is where we are cleaning up everything, and we hope that it is crisp and clean when it goes to press. This is the last line of defense. Now, copy editors are not the only line of defense. Writers should be doing their best job to find errors. Content editors are looking for those big picture errors, but copy editors really are our last line of defense. These people are finding all these last errors. So here's your copy editor's toolbox. In general, the style book is really valuable. So the Associated Press style book is a printed book. You can order a copy of it. It's about $27. They also offer an online version, which is about $29. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But the copybook's really valuable. If you are in person and editing on paper, my favorite tool is to use a flare pen, lots of colors. And I've noticed that students really love this as well. And then the last thing that I have for you is copy editing marks. So you're going to find a lot of the same kinds of mistakes in yearbook stories and headlines and captions. It's words spelled wrong. It's things capitalized that shouldn't be capitalized. It's rearrangement of copy. And so knowing consistent copy editing marks will help everyone understand exactly what changes are needed. So with the style book, I would definitely recommend in the classroom having a copy or two. I don't think that it's necessary for every student to have their own, because this can kind of be used like a dictionary or a resource that you can pull off the shelf and use. I have had students who love the style book so much that they ask for one for Christmas, and that's really cool. With the style book, there is a new edition that comes out every year. But actually this year at the 2020 convention for copy editors, they said that now they're going to do it every 2 years. So the thing that changes between year to year are updates to style. And you guys might have noticed that there have been some different style updates recently, as far as how we refer to things, how we capitalize things, how we hyphenate things. That's the style book is going to tell you consistently how newspapers and news organizations should show that in copy. So when I was very poor and in college, I bought a style book, and then every year when the new one would come out, I would just see what new additions there were, and then I would handwrite them into my current style book. And that way my book was always up to date, even though it wasn't that current year. I will tell you that in the last couple of years, the number of changes has increased dramatically from year to year. I think this past year there were 200 additions, and when I was in college it was maybe 10 to 20 additions. And so doing the handwritten update might not be the best method, but if you do an online style book, it is automatically updated with any changes. And the online style book will also let you have a local version of style. So when you have things that are specific to your school and your publication, you can document those in the online version. And that way you can always see quickly, color guard, 2 words, or this is how we refer to our mascot. And these are the things that we capitalize on at our school because they are proper nouns. So this is your copy editor toolbox. This is kind of fun. You'll come up with your own editing symbols. Your staff will come up with stuff. The ones that I use the most that are like not official copy editing symbols are, I do the heart a lot with a kid who does something really great and you just love it. You know, you're going to put a heart and say that this is an awesome paragraph. I really love it. But this is kind of funny to share with kids. So how do you add copy editing into your curriculum? I am the kind of person who put copy editing quizzes as part of my lesson planning, and kids really enjoyed this because it added a little bit of competition to class. This generally was not for a grade. We would have quizzes where the person who scored the highest would get a new flare pen of whatever color choosing. You could also have maybe like a poster on the wall with kids who make 100 on the copy editing quiz, they get a sticker, and so you could kind of have that kind of competition. If you wanted to use it for an actual grade, you could. These are 4 resources of places to find quizzes. ACES is really good. That's the American Society of Copy Editors. But the Journalism Education Association, UIL in Texas, and the New York Times all have different variations of copy editing quizzes. You can always make up your own as well. You could challenge your editors to create a quiz for the rest of the staff based on common errors that they see. So quizzes are a way to incorporate that into your curriculum. And then I also really love podcasts. Grammar Girl is a popular podcast, and she explains so many things about word usage and why we say certain things. It's very short podcast, 10 to 15 minutes, and there's like hundreds of topics. And so if you have students who are really struggling with a particular concept when it comes to editing work, maybe they don't understand the difference between affect and effect. She has a podcast about that. So look for those, and that can really help reinforce things for your students. So when we talk about copy editing standards, they're the general things that we just say are a standard for all writing. So it doesn't matter if it's in a headline, if it's a caption, or it's a story, there are things that need to be upheld to a standard. We are committed to telling the story of our year in a compelling, authentic, journalistic manner. And that's whether it's in a headline, a caption, or a story. We're going to have correct punctuation. We're going to use words correctly, and we're going to spell everything correctly in headlines, captions, and stories. Another thing that we don't do is that we don't say our school's name or initials. And that's because this book only pertains to us. And so saying our name and our initials is redundant. Same as saying what year it is or this year. This yearbook is only for this year for our school. So we don't have to say our name, our initials, or our year. And then we can't editorialize. We don't have any opinions in our headlines, in our captions, or our stories. So these are standards that are general. It doesn't matter what we're editing for, they're gonna cross all of these topics. So now let's specifically talk about headlines. So if you are a content editor, you are the first editor who's going to be reading this headline, what are you looking for? Mostly we're looking for the headline isn't a label. And label just means that you are labeling it whatever the subject is. So say you have a story about JV girls soccer. If the headline is JV girls soccer, that's not going to work. That's a label. That's not a headline. And so the content editor is going to send that back. Now, when it gets to the second level of editing, copy editing, we're going to look for more specific things. We don't want it to state the obvious. We want it to have a great verb. We want it to have a verb in the present tense, and that we're following style for numbers. If we can have a visual verbal connection to our dominant photo, that is even better. So here's an example from Aledo High School, and their headline was Leap into Action. And I pulled this because this is a great example of a visual verbal connection. Visually, we see people leaping. Verbally, we read the words leap. That's a visual verbal connection when those things are connected. Captions. So as we are looking through captions, as a content editor, what are you looking for? Well, did somebody try to write a caption? Yearbook is notorious for pictures being submitted from a photographer with no caption attempted. So we want to attempt that a caption has been written. If it's a dominant photo on the page, I highly, highly recommend that you include a quote to be in that caption. So those are two things that a content editor would be looking for. Copy editor, looking for very specific things, is going to see, have we used the proper tenses? Now, if you're confused about what tenses are used in which sentences on a caption, I would recommend that you go to the session, The Right Stuff. That one I'm teaching, and it goes over all of the formats of captions, body copy, and headlines. So there are specific tenses for each sentence in a caption. We also want to make sure that people are identified. If there are 5 or fewer people in the photograph, we need to have all their names. If there are more than 5, then we could use a collective word like the cheerleaders or the sophomores. We want to make sure that we're being consistent on what grade levels people are in. If we spell it out, if we say junior Kelly Juntunen, or do we say Kelly Juntunen and then in parentheses we say 11 so that that refers to junior year, that needs to be consistent throughout the book. And it's a copy editor's job to make sure that that looks the same no matter where you are. We want to answer as many of the 5 W's and the H as possible and appropriate. Not all of them are important to a caption, so we need to make sure that we know what's valuable to share with our readers and what could be left out. And then we also want to vary the caption leads. How we start our caption, we don't want to repeat the same style over and over and over again. I have a handout from Balfour that gives you lots of examples of how to vary your leads. And so you'll have this as a reference as well. And I like to give that to students so that they can look at different ways to begin a caption. Sports captions need to give the result of the play. So if you are showing a baseball player, he's the pitcher and he's, throwing from the mound, it would be super great if you could say that he struck out that particular batter, if that's correct, or any other details. At the least, you should say what the score of the game was at the conclusion of the game. We want to have those results as part of a sports caption. Here's an example from Hill Country Day School. This was a really cute picture of a kid riding his bike. And you'll notice that after the student's name, Connor, it says PK in parentheses. And so that's referring to what his grade level is. He has a quote in the caption, which is awesome. Little kid quotes are always exciting and interesting, and you never know what you're going to get. But also, this photo is the dominant picture. This actually is part of a fold out, and so this picture is enormous. And so I was really happy to see that they included a quote. If a picture is so great that you make it enormous on your spread, then it deserves a little more detail in the caption to explain more about the photo. So body copy. And like I said, body copy the ways that people are creating yearbooks now, straight stories are not necessarily the only way that we present copy on a page. Sometimes an alternative story format is a much better method. And also, as people are becoming less likely to read long bits of copy, we look at ways to break it up to make it a little more magazine style. But I'm going to talk to you about, in a general story, a content editor would be looking for, did we talk to the appropriate sources? Did we talk to people who were involved, who were part of the decision making, who had a really emotional experience with this particular topic? And that we talked to at least 2 people. It depends on what your expectations are for your staff as far as the minimum number of sources. I would say on a body story, 2 is the minimum, but the more stories, the more people that you're able to interview, the more interesting your story gets, because now you have choices on what content to use, as opposed to using every little thing that you got because you only got a little bit. Now we have choices on, we talked to lots of people, let's take the best of what we got. So minimum of 2 sources, and you might, as a content editor, say, you use 2 sources, but like, I'm really not getting the story. I'm not feeling anything. It's not making sense. So you might ask the writer to go back and conduct another interview. We also want a really interesting lead. Besides headlines, which are the most read piece of writing on a page, the lead of a story is kind of, you grab them or you don't. And if you don't get them with that lead, then they're not going to read the rest of your story. So this is a very, very important piece of your story. You want to use this paragraph to pull out the most interesting thing that you have and to grab the reader's attention so that they'll read the rest of what you have. Then we also want to make sure that the story is not too generic, and that can happen if you don't have enough sources. If you could lift out that story and put it on a different year, like take out the homecoming story from this year and then put it on 2 years ago's layout, and it still makes sense and you didn't have to change much, then that's a very generic story. Every story that you put in your yearbook should be specific to this school year. So if it's too generic, a content editor should send it back to the writer and say, hey, you need to ask some different questions. We need to look at some different angles. We need to talk to some different people. It's too generic. We want to follow our writing formats, which if you go to the right stuff, I'll show you a lot more details about exactly how to line up your stories. And then now we look at copy editing. So we've gone through this first level of content editing. What do we do to fine tune, make sure that this story is just right? Well, we want to make sure that it is colorful, it's descriptive, it's storytelling, and that it really adds to the depth of our book. We want to have stories in our book that make us understand what that year was like. And the question that you can ask writers a lot of times, especially if they don't have a lot of colorful verbs or descriptive adjectives, is what didn't you use? And if they used every single thing that they got during the interview process, then they probably didn't do enough interviews, because we want to be able to pick and choose from what we have. We want to pick out the best stuff and leave these things that aren't very specific. So what didn't you use is a really great question to ask a writer. We want to make sure that these sentences are short. We want to have transitions so that everything flows smoothly. Our transitions can't repeat what's in the quote. We have a new paragraph after each quote, and this is all very much explained in the Right Stuff session. Nitty-gritty things. Our spelling is correct. Our capitalization has been verified. Students have a tendency to do what I call crapitalization. Actually, my husband does this a lot. It's like where you just capitalize a random word because you're trying to emphasize it, or I don't even know why things are capitalized for this reason, but it's a thing that kids do, and husbands apparently, but we want to check all these spelling and capitalizations. We want to make sure that all of our tenses and our persons are used correctly. We're following style for numbers. We're avoiding these words like many, some, a lot that are indefinite. We want to avoid anything editorial. We can't say that something is terrific or beautiful. Those are our opinions. We let the person being interviewed say that stuff, and that's where we can give those emotional words. Editorial adverbs, gracefully, skillfully, those are still opinions. We avoid cliches, and we always use the word said. And a lot of people ask why we stick with said in journalistic writing. And I've heard that English teachers even have a lesson called Said is Dead. And they try to give you all these variety of words to use instead of said. And what it comes down to is that journalistic writing, the things that we write, our words, we want to make sure that they're as neutral as possible. And when we start to use synonyms for said, sometimes that pulls in some opinion. And so any opinion needs to be through your interviewee. That needs to be through the quote or a paraphrase of the quote. But with the attribution verb, when we use that said, we're being very neutral. And so I would highly recommend that you stick with that as well. This is a really good example of this is a really unique story. This came from Bridgeland High School. The boys and girls teamed up for this 4x400 relay, which I thought was really cool because I had not heard about this. But you'll notice that there are multiple sources, so that's really great. You can see consistency in how each student is referenced to their grade level, and they actually highlight the student name, which I thought was really cool, an easy way to find them in the story. This is really a news intro, a news lead, and so that's fine because this is really a news story. It's not necessarily feature. So this is a great example, and showing your students examples of a good headline, a good caption, a good story. It's ways to reinforce what you're expecting and what you're looking for. So the things that I'm going to end on are ways to actually conduct copy editing in your classroom. So with content editing, I really recommend doing that with Google Docs and doing it in suggestion mode. With suggestion mode, it's where you can add those paragraphs out to the side. You can select a particular sentence so that it refers back to that one. But suggestion mode really is having a conversation with the writer about what they've done and suggestions that you would make. They can take your suggestions, they could not take your suggestions, but really you have a place to document everything that you're thinking as you're writing it. So I really like Google Docs for that. I do like Google Docs for copy editing as well. And I would recommend doing that in suggestion mode too. Now you could do it in editing mode, which means that if you go in and you make a change, like it is made, like it adjusts the copy to what you say it should be. With suggestion mode, you can make the change, but it requires the original owner of the document to accept the change. I always do things in suggestion mode because I feel like for our students to learn from copy editing process, they need to be able to see what changes are suggested and go ahead and say, like, I agree with that, I don't agree with that. If they didn't agree with the suggestion, I would have them go talk to that particular editor, not just delete it and deny it, because they don't like it. But for them to absorb the skills, I think that they should see and make the changes themselves. So the last thing that I'll tell you is a really fun activity. Fun for someone who loves copy editing is the round robin copy editing. So this is with an actual printout of a story, or you could even do it with an entire spread. And you could do this with multiple spreads. So say you have 10 spreads that are ready to be submitted to the yearbook plan. But before you send them in, you want to do one last fine-tune copy editing. Make sure you haven't missed anything. So what I would do is I would get as many kids as you have who can devote the time to a class period on copy editing and line us all up in around a circle table or something like that. hand everyone their own individual copy of a spread. So everyone would get a different spread. So if you had 10 kids and 10 spreads, everybody gets, you know, one of the 10 to be submitted. And then I would assign each student to look for specific things. It can be overwhelming to look for all the things. And so maybe student 1 is only looking at numbers and attribution. So they're going to look in the headlines, they're going to look in the captions, they're going to look in the story, and they're going to see, you know, has any time that we used a number, was it done according to AP style? Anytime that we, you know, have attribution of a quote, did we use the word said? So if they're only looking for 1 or 2 things, it really helps them narrow down, you know, because it could be overwhelming. So set a timer, say 2 minutes, and have them read through, scan through, look for any of their specific errors. And then when the timer goes off, you're going to pass your spread to the person on the other side of you. You get a new spread and timer starts again, and you are looking for the things that you look for, numbers, attribution. Now the other kids could be doing things like someone looking at verbs, someone looking at editorializing, someone name checking and looking up every name that's on that page to make sure that it was spelled correctly. So by dividing and conquering, it helps you kind of get in on that quality editing, because we're reducing the number of things that you're looking for. This is the end of our copy editing session. So if you guys want to stick around, I am happy to answer any questions that you have, or just talk copy editing shop in general. But you are welcome to stick around, and I'm happy to chat.